Check, check. Well, check. There we go.
Oh, what? It was just an unplugged plug.
No, it just needed to be reset. Okay, the audio is going to be really crackly right now, so I got to reset it again.
Okay.
But we're getting closer. Yeah, let's see. Talking to yours? You're going to have to turn on a little thing here. There we go.
Check.
No, not yet. Okay, now you should have something.
Testing. You got it?
We got no Bobby. What is happening with Bobby? Let's do... Check. Give me a test. There we go.
Testing.
There we
that it?
go. Look at this. What a crazy night.
There we go.
What a crazy night.
I really liked the moment where you were like, let's just figure it out so we can
We're
say
doing it.
We did it.
No matter what.
That's the determination
Holy
the world
cow.
needs, Jeremy
Okay.
Duncan.
So people are here. They can hear. You can hear us? That sounded for a second. Yes. Loud. Andy Vanny says it's loud. Andy, have we got the audio working properly now? It should be better. I can see my monitor here.
Oh,
That it's not too bad sounding. How's
Okay.
Bobby sounding?
Yeah. Testing. Check. I'm still looking for the video here. Did you post the link?
I did post a link.
Okay.
Yeah. What a crazy night. Okay, so
Yeah.
here's...
I mean, we're almost a half an hour late, so.
I know.
And Andy's still here.
Anybody who stuck with us, we appreciate it. So here's what we did. We had... I'm not sure where exactly, but we had some kind of DHCP issue where our streaming encoder, for some reason, was grabbing the wrong IP address internally in our network. And I'm not sure exactly what's happening. It might have been on a different VLAN in our system. Either that or it was just doubling up with an IP address that was already assigned. And I tried a whole bunch of things. I tried restarting it. I tried reconnecting the network.
You did.
And then I had to manually go in and assign a new IP address because that was my last track. And we got it working. So
amazing.
This is when we need Andy Vanny here. He could have helped us. He probably would have figured this out in like 5 seconds. He would have been
that's what we need.
You got
we always need Andy in the room.
Yeah, he got a network connection. Bobby's a bit quieter. Okay, I'll turn her up a little bit here.
Yeah. I can lean in a bit as well.
Lean in.
Lean in. I think there's a book by that title.
There is. I'm going to give you a little more gain.
All right. Test.
Okay, you want to talk about something?
Oh, man.
Holy cow,
we should just
what
dive
a day.
in. Give the people what they came here for. What did you all come here for?
For the technical difficulties. That's what they came here for. Holy cow.
Yeah, I know.
Now, how was your day?
I just need to kind of settle, right?
I know.
Just settle into this moment. My day was good. We had team hangs here. We did our team meeting, which was good. I got a bike ride in. I got a walk in. So I spent a little time outside.
I also got a walk in this morning, just with my dog as normal. But I don't know if you saw the cloud just hanging over the city. It was actually quite incredible. When I was walking, you could see the mountains in the sun super clearly.
Oh, yeah.
And then this huge cloud just dragging over the city.
Yeah.
I took a couple pictures of it.
Yeah.
And it was cool. And I sent them to my wife, and she was like, oh, neat. But it wasn't the same as sort of being there. It was really
it was kind of strange. Like this like cloud of doom. Did you ever do you remember the Truman the Truman Show with Jim Carrey? Yeah. And I always think about that moment where he's on the beach and there's that rain cloud above him and he's trying down. It was sort of like the city was under that cloud today, just it
was totally under that cloud.
Is it a Chinook arc in this time of year?
I mean,
that's
I guess
what it
you could
looks
still
like.
Technically have a Chinook. I mean, it's not going to bring drastic temperature changes, but you're still getting the, what is it? Low pressure that comes over the mountain, or high pressure?
To be
Whatever.
fair,
I'm not a meteorologist.
I've lived here for over 4 years now, and still, when there's like maybe a Chinook, I have to ask people, is this a Chinook? Like, I don't really get it.
Asha says it is a Chinook arc, but
okay.
But what is that? Is that a
asked.
low pressure coming over the mountain or high pressure coming over the mountain? That's what I never remember.
I don't think the people are here to
not even
hear
sure
us talk about weather.
It doesn't even have anything to do with pressure. I mean, I just made that up. All right.
Okay. Well, We should just dive in.
Sure.
I mean, do we want to chat a little bit about like a check-in, or do we just want to go for
Let's just go. We're at 8:30 already.
Yeah,
We've had IP assigning.
Yeah, let's just go there.
Address problems.
No small talk.
Holy cow.
We are in our Inspired series, and we're in the third. We did the third one.
Yeah, we just did the third one. Scott's doing the fourth one.
Yeah, that's great.
It is. It's really good.
Yeah, I'm excited.
So, yeah, it's good. We're talking about the Psalms and poetry.
Oh, he did tell me that.
Yeah, but that's next week. That's not this week.
Not this week. We'll talk about it next
week.
So this week you were talking about history and violence.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was going through your sermon and your notes today, I was thinking, I mean, where was Jeremy Duncan's voice in like... I like that. In like all of the study Bibles.
I was busy quoting myself.
Do you know like all of the study Bibles for like Bible college kids trying to make sense of these violent narratives in the scriptures? And I feel like repeatedly what you get from a lot of those notes in those big Bibles with the notes along the bottom of the page is like option A, which was your...
Yeah, I'm trying to remember how I laid them out. I went through 3 different ways of thinking about it. I can't remember what order I did them.
So we were talking about like when you encounter violent text and you're not sure what to do with it. And you said we typically have 3 options. 1, God uses violence to get to God's end. Right. That was your language, right? Number 2, I rephrased it as like they're evil and they deserve it.
Right.
Yeah.
Like okay.
Yeah. And number 3, you said archaeological record, which I feel like you could expand on.
Probably could.
It was an interesting like decision to name that as option 3.
Yeah. So you're right. I mean, I think the first 2, I think actually the second one is the most common.
Do you?
If I had to pick, I think so. This idea that
I don't know, but I feel like Mike's okay. They both get a lot of airtime. Right.
Yeah.
I think we could say that.
Yeah. So the first option is that God is God and God can do what God wants. And if God wants to kill a bunch of people, God can do that. And to be fair, I think this is part of why this series is important the way we've laid it out, because if you already have a reading of Noah that says, sometimes God wipes out planets, is it that big a deal that God wipes out Canaanites? Right. Like how you set the story up, kind of unfolds in terms of how we read, which becomes really important because as I quoted Robert Allen Warrior, but he says, like once we buy into the conquest narrative, that's okay.
Right.
That's actually the ideology that was used in terms of the conquest of indigenous populations in North America. Mm-hmm. So, if you've already bought into the idea that, sometimes God wipes out whole planets with floods. Mm-hmm. Sometimes God wipes out people groups because, God wants that land. Mm-hmm. Then why can't we wipe out indigenous populations, now that we've discovered this land? So, I mean, these are not just purely theoretical, theological debates. I mean, they have very real implications for real human beings.
Oh, yeah.
So that's the first one. God can do whatever God wants, and sometimes God uses violence. Yeah. The second one is sort of the same. I mean, God's using violence, but it's because people deserved it. Like God would never. It's not just like they were living on the land and God wanted the land, so God wiped them out. Right. It's that. They didn't deserve that. They were evil. Yeah. They did these terrible things. And to be fair, we did talk later in the sermon about some of the child sacrifices in some of the Canaanite religions and stuff. And so that's why people put that together. Right. They were wicked, they were evil, they were doing these terrible things that the Hebrews were not supposed to do, which is true. I mean, we read that later in the text. Yeah. Therefore, God just wiped them out, almost as an act of mercy. But the archaeological record, the reason I named it that is because if you set the Bible aside and you go look at the record in terms of archaeology and in terms of what we discovered from these types of sayings, you realize that they're not actually sort of objective records of history. Right. Because we have the Moabite king declaring the same thing about the Israelites that the Israelite king is declaring about like the Moabites.
The vernacular of the day.
Exactly.
To speak in these ways.
Yeah, and I loved Walter Brueggemann's quote where he says, you have to bring a class reading to these texts.
What does he mean by that?
So he means that what we actually see is the more of an underdog this nation was, the more hyperbolic their language is. So you have to read it in terms of who's the power center and who's the underdog in these stories. And what happened in the ancient world was the more of an underdog you were, the less likely you were to prevail, the more grandiose your language was.
It's rap music.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
rap music. Yeah. It is like...
It's a great comparison.
I live with that comparison. Yeah. It actually helps me so much as I hold these texts to think about, like, if you have been oppressed generation after generation, ghettoized, drugs have taken over your family system because of so much trauma and oppression from outside, from the powers that should take care of you. What do your victory songs sound like whilst you're oppressed? They sound like this. They sound like
and I mean, literally
Jay-Z.
in the Psalms, we see Psalms like, happy is the one who dashes their enemies' babies on the rocks. Like, I mean, just terrible stuff. Right. Which is exactly that. Like, you're so beaten down. Yeah. All you want is to let that frustration out. Right. And that's a little bit of what we're seeing in these things. The other thing is, in the archaeological record, there doesn't seem to be the kinds of populations and the kinds of changeovers
that we see written on the page. Yeah.
Like, there wasn't, millions of Israelites marching in and slaughtering millions of Canaanites. Like, it just didn't happen. It's not there in the archaeological record. Right. So then the question becomes, well, okay, what's the story about? Yeah. How are those words being used in terms of political propaganda? Right. And also, what do they tell us about the story that's unfolding over time? Yeah. In terms of who God is. Right. Because mashed together with these verses in Deuteronomy talking about taking over the land, you also get the voice of God saying, hey, take in the foreigner and the fatherless, the widow, treat the alien among you as your own because you were, foreigners once in the land of Egypt. Like, there's these sort of conflicting messages that are happening there. And so understanding, okay, one is propagandizing a national story to galvanize the nation. One is the voice of God that's counterbalancing that and bringing some more depth and breadth to the whole thing. And then the last thing is, this is not archaeological record, but the biblical record shows us that they didn't wipe out all the Canaanites.
Right. Like, you trace the Canaanites.
You can see all these Canaanites. Yeah. And by the way, on Sunday, I introduced you to, like, Jethro and Caleb the Kenizzite and Askar, his daughter. And I'm using all these terms like Kenizzite and stuff. Those are all of those different sort of nationalities that I reference fit under the sort of umbrella of the Canaanites. The Canaanites were a collection of Semitic tribes back then.
So when you pick up your NIV Bible, what are you seeing? Are you seeing variations of that word?
So
like, what happens in the translation?
It's tricky because it's not necessarily a bad translation, but it doesn't always bring a lot of clarity to it, because
you might not make connected
exactly
dots on
because
your own.
When it's talking about coming in and wiping out the Canaanites, that's a generic term for all these tribes. And then later you'll meet a Jebusite and a Kenite and all these different people. And you might not realize, okay, those are all Canaanites. Right. They're just different, tribes or ethnic groups within that sort of umbrella covering of these ancient Semitic worlds.
I'm waiting for the Jeremy Duncan Study Bible.
Yeah. Exactly. But I mean, there's that one, I'm trying to remember where it was, but I quoted, I think from Judges or Joshua, where it says, like, that the Jebusites are living to this day in Jerusalem with the Benjamites. Right. Like this is somebody well after the fact, reflecting on the stories of the conquest and saying, like, to this day, they still live here among us. They're still living with us. Yeah. So, I mean, clearly you can't take those kind of commands to slaughter everyone just at face value. They're important. They're part of the story. Yeah. But we sort of have to dig and we have to read these different ways. Class reading, understanding national propaganda, understanding how that narrative fits in with the historical record. Like, it's complicated.
It is really complicated. So speaking of complicated, what I wanted to do, I pulled some of the words that came up again and again in your sermon, and I wanted to go through those. Yeah. Even just the word hermeneutic. Yeah. You gave it a definition, You didn't use interpretation though, which I thought was interesting. No. Like you said, meaning. Yeah. You attached it to the word meaning.
So hermeneutic.
So let's talk a little bit more about what, because I think that's what we're doing with this series. But so I thought it might be interesting to spend a bit more time with the word.
So outside of biblical scholarship, hermeneutic is how we derive meaning from something. Mm-hmm. Now that includes interpretation. Yeah. But it's not just interpretation. It is the bigger idea of where meaning comes from, how we make meaning, how we create meaning, how we understand that. Part of that is, okay, here's a text, here's how we translate it. Here's how we interpret that translation. But it also comes into, do you put all of that in a story? Or do you systematize it into like a system? Like those are two different ways of creating meaning in something. Mm-hmm. So when I talk about Jesus is our hermeneutic, what I'm saying is the story of Jesus is the way that we are going to make meaning of all of these texts. So we're going to look at the history, we're going to look at the archaeology, we're going to dig through all that. But ultimately, what I'm going to say is, if I can't make sense of this in the light of Jesus, then I'm either going to set it aside and come back to it. Mm-hmm. I'm going to keep studying more. Yeah. Or I'm going to pray. I'm going to ask the Spirit of God to help me be creative in terms of how I reinterpret these things. Right. Because the meaning I'm going to get out of this is how it leads me to Jesus. And that's the conviction that I'm going in. When I talked about presuppositions and prolegomena, that's what I'm going into this story with. Right. So, yeah. Okay. How do you use hermeneutic?
I probably just connect it to interpretation more, but I appreciate the larger space that you're making for it.
Yeah. Is it, I don't know how meaningful it is to do that, but.
Yeah. I was curious about it. Okay. Another word I put on my little list is Commonwealth.
Commonwealth. Oh, yeah.
I mean, we've talked a little bit about this.
We have talked about this before.
Do you want to talk about it?
Sure.
Okay. So,
what do you want to say about it?
Well, it's interesting because I picked up on it a while ago. Yeah. I was like, that's not something that you've used a lot. So, so you were saying together kingdom and commonwealth. Yeah. Kingdom and commonwealth, kingdom and commonwealth. So heads up, on Sunday's liturgy, I did put commonwealth into the liturgy. So, if you listen to it.
So I mean, it's an attempt to find or expand our vocabulary around what is the center of Jesus' message, which is the kingdom of God. Mm-hmm. So the core of what Jesus preaches, the core of what Jesus is about, is this idea of the kingdom of God, the basileia theou. Mm-hmm. That's the language in Greek, right? Mm-hmm. The problem with that is we don't live anymore in a world where we have kings, where we have kingdoms, so it's a little distanced from us as a first issue. Yeah. Because, we don't live in sort of these
political
monarchies.
Configuration.
Right. We have something like different now. The second is, again, we don't run away from gendered language when it comes to God. There's a lot of gendered language when it comes to God. Most of the language in the Bible is gendered, either female or male. Like there's a mixture.
But it is mostly male.
Mostly male, yes, absolutely. But I think it's important to also have language that stretches beyond that.
Yes.
I think father language is beautiful. I think kingdom language is beautiful. I think if our only ways to conceptualize God are masculine and are tied to authority, then I think we're losing out on something. Yeah. Now, I worry a little bit about dropping that language completely, right? Because I think it plays a role.
Right. You worry more than me.
Yeah. But I think we need to balance those things. Like I would think the same thing if we said, if we only used mother language for God, and that became the only way that we talked about God.
I mean, we could do it for maybe 5 years.
We could do it for a couple centuries. But eventually, you would start to miss out on something, right? Like, there's no danger of that. And so I'm talking theoretically here, because there's no danger of us swinging so far to the other side that we forget sort of masculine imagery about God. Like, it's not a real argument. It's a strawman argument. But I do think that's important to retain this idea of, hey, we have this multiplicity of images.
Yes.
How do we hang on to them? So Commonwealth is one attempt by me to sort of say, okay, let's push that language out a little bit more.
Yes.
And let's imagine the ruling and reign of God in a way that's less autocratic and less authoritarian.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that's what Jesus is saying at all with kingdom language.
If you spend any time with the narratives, you will not see
right,
a jeweled crown and a scepter in the ways that you are maybe.
In fact, I think a lot of what Jesus is doing by using that language is contrasting the rule of God with the rule of Rome.
Yeah.
Right. So when we're using it in a sort of disconnected context, and it's not subversive anymore,
exactly,
right? Because there's no kingdom to subvert. We're actually missing a lot of the meaning, right? Because a lot of it was God is not like Caesar.
Yeah.
You know, God is bigger than Caesar, over Caesar, but not like Caesar.
It should be shocking to hear Jesus use that language.
And so when we use kingdom, we're missing a big part of what's going on with that language because it's not subverting things for us.
Right.
So that's one thing. Commonwealth is not perfect, but I'm interested in it because what it does is it creates a sense of mutuality in terms of the ruling of God. You know, there's still a way to operate in, you know, the Commonwealth or the kingdom of God, right? There's still a way that honors God, but it becomes out of this sense of mutuality that I know who I am now.
Right.
I know that I'm loved by God. I operate this way. You know, God is not above me, but God is with me. God is leading me still. It's not me and God on equal terms with each other, but it's also not me as this ant and God, you know, cracking the whip or something.
Right.
It's invitation, it's movement, it's partnership.
Right.
So I like that. And then Commonwealth, like the Commons, I mean, that's what we named our church, but you know, the Commons are the shared resources of the Commonwealth, right? So the air is part of the Commons. Theoretically, the water is part of the Commons. Nobody owns that. We share that together. And so even all of these ideas of replacing kingdom with something that we're in this together, we're sharing this together, we share the story together, we build the story together, God walks with us in the story is interesting. Layering on top of that, the moving away from the exclusively gendered language that we speak about God. So again, I speak about God as a father if that's the metaphor.
Yeah.
But generally I talk about God, I talk about God's self.
Yeah.
But as soon as I then talk about God's kingdom, now I'm half in, you know, this God language, and I'm half in this masculine language, you know, because a kingdom is not a man,
right?
But it's named on this idea of the king, the man.
Yeah. Well, I'm just enjoying the sort of playfulness of this moment of your decision to move forward with this word, because I think there is something like in our human experience that sort of craves something poetic, something that, like, I think when words get used over and over and over and over and over again, they're kind of dulled. And I think a lot of the language of our sort of current configuration of popular Christianity is like, here's the bucket of metaphors that we always use, and there's not a lot of like movement outside of it. And quite frankly, just kind of gets boring. Like I think there's room for us to find ways that our language can be more just, more inclusive.
And, you know, Commonwealth works in some ways, specifically based in Canada, like where Commonwealth is a system of government for us. We are part of the Commonwealth. You know, would it work as well in the States? Maybe not, because, you know, I think in some sense, we have a positive view of Commonwealth. Like, it's not a negative word for us. But in some sense, when you say that, God's Commonwealth, you are contrasting the current system of government with something better. Right. You know, if you're an American and you hear that, does it mean anything? Right. You've probably heard the term before, but it doesn't, it doesn't have that same kind of juxtaposition. Right. But for me, I like it. Yeah. You know? I'm here for it. Yeah. Okay, cool. We've had this conversation around the office. Yeah. I mean, just trying to figure out like, what language can we use? How can we talk about these things? How can we push our thinking? Right. You know? And I'm a bit more sensitive to language. I just crave something that hasn't always like been representative of my experience or my theology. Like, and I really like language. Like, that's what I do. Right. I like playing with those things. So I like thinking about that. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, that's fun. Let's see, where do you want to go now? Is there anything that you really want to pick up on, or kind of back to the theme of this week's message? Well, I think the one thing that's actually most challenging about this message is really not what do we do with the violence of the Old Testament?
Okay.
I mean, I think a lot of us have kind of wrapped our heads around that.
Do you think so?
Yeah, I mean, not everybody.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people have sort of made peace with the idea that, okay, this is an unfolding narrative. We see violence in the historical narrative. That makes sense. We should expect that. We shouldn't be thrown off by that.
Right. It's a particular time. It's a particular place.
Yeah.
Keep that in mind.
Yeah, and however you interpret God in the mix of that, I think people have made sense of that. I think, the idea of the cross and what's happening there with the violence.
You want to go there?
We can talk about it. How much time we got?
We have 15 minutes.
15 minutes?
Yeah, because that was actually one of the words on my list. I just kind of cut it off. I didn't know if you wanted to do something else. Because, I mean, what was some of your language? I don't know if you want to, how do you want to go about talking about this? Do you want to map out like different atonement theories? Do you want
That's an interesting one.
Yeah.
What's your favorite atonement theory?
Oh, gosh. I don't know.
So I mean, so
I
people
love the
understand.
idea of being like multi-metaphor, right? I want to have room to like locate these different theories in the text and allow them to like have different resonance in my life. Yeah.
So we've talked about this before. Yeah. But just so everyone, as a refresher, there's Christian dogma, which is that through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, we are made at one with God. Mm-hmm. That's what Christians believe, all Christians. I would hazard to say that if you reject that, then you're probably outside of Christianity in terms of Orthodox Christianity. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean you're a bad person. Doesn't mean God doesn't love you. Doesn't mean you're not going to heaven. Nothing like that. It just means, in terms of the classical sense of what we mean by that word. What we get stuck on sometimes is there's all kinds of different theories of the atonement in terms of how that works. Yeah. How exactly in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus are we made at one with God? And what's happened in the last few hundred years is one particular theory called penal substitutionary atonement has dominated a lot of the imagination. And so when you go to the study Bibles, depending on who the publisher is, a lot of what you're going to read.
Yeah. It's so much of it.
Is penal substitution. And this is a systematic approach which basically argues that no, God really did like sacrifices, and God can only forgive when there is a blood sacrifice. Mm-hmm. That's why there were sacrifices in the temple. The only way that we get away from blood sacrifices is to have a sacrifice that's so great and so good that God can use that to forgive all of our sins, and that's Jesus. Yeah. So God demands a blood sacrifice. Right. We sacrifice all kinds of animals, and eventually God says, okay, I've had enough dead animals. Here's my son. This is going to be the best ultimate sacrifice, and that will finish everything. Right. And the argument there would be that, what the atonement is just, a final sacrifice to end all sacrifices. Right. I don't think that's consistent with the full biblical narrative. Mm-hmm. And that's what we walked through a little bit on Sunday, this place where God does say, okay, you need to know you're forgiven, bring me a sacrifice, do this, and then
how
you'll
you
know.
Mapped out Leviticus.
Exactly.
That was your sort of three phases, how you kind of simplified these major arcs in the scriptures. You went with Leviticus and sacrifice. You went with the prophets and looking out for the underdog. Mm-hmm. Basically, right?
That's one way, but it's a shift from the ritual sacrifice.
Oh, it's calling it into right.
Yeah, into being in your heart and who you are.
Yeah, I don't need all of these piles of sacrifices. Yeah. That's what you did. I'm interested in your heart. Yeah. Right. So
and
that's
then
the
moving
prophets
to
into Jesus, right?
Yeah, and I think that is that. I think what the prophets show us is. God is clearly saying, I don't want sacrifices. I don't need sacrifices.
Right. And
you need sacrifices. Right. You need to
know
you're
forgiven. So I can work with that. You were, that was sort of one of your lines. Like, all right, everybody worships this way. I can work with that.
Totally.
Essentially.
We're gonna reform sacrifice. Right. We're not gonna do child sacrifices. Right. We're not gonna sacrifice in front of an idol that limits your imagination of God to a specific people group. Yeah. Or ethnicity, because that's what idols were used for. Mm-hmm. So we're going to do away with that, but we'll still have a ritual. You will still know that you're forgiven because you've gone through the steps. Yeah. But by the time you get to the prophets, God is speaking again, and God is saying, look, those were never for me.
Yeah.
What I wanted was a broken heart, a contrite spirit. I wanted change in you. I wanted justice. I wanted you to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Sacrifices were always for you. Right. And now you keep doing them, but you aren't changing. And I've had enough. I don't want any more of this. I'm done with it.
Yeah.
You know, like there's some harsh stuff in Isaiah where he's like, I'm not listening to your prayers. Right. I'm not listening to your songs. Gosh, right. I'm not showing up at your festivals. I'm not coming to your meals. Like God is just like, I'm done.
Still applies.
Totally. You know?
Right.
But I think what that shows is.
You can't be good to your neighbors.
Exactly. Yeah. Wow. And what that shows though is God was never bound by the rule of ritual in terms of God really wants to forgive. Like God is loving and wants to forgive. But God can't unless there's a sacrifice, unless you bring that goat, or unless Jesus comes and dies. Then it's like God, like people tell the story as if God's hands are tied.
Right.
Like, I love you, I want to forgive you, but I can't.
I think that's where a lot of people walk away, right? It is like, people have this hunch that like, what kind of God is that?
Yeah.
Like, if that's
well, it's not God.
Is,
I mean, it's like a lesser deity.
Yes.
Who somebody made a rule.
But that's what I'm saying is that this gets taught again and again and again and again, and it's like if you want to call yourself a Christian, like this is what you have to believe about God. And I think a lot of people I went to Bible college with, for example, get this feeling like I'm a better parent than that God is to God's own son. So that sort of crisis of like,
I mean, it's quite provocative language, but Rita Nakashimi Brock, calls this way of thinking about the atonement is cosmic child abuse.
This is what the word I wanted to say. I was like, is it too far if I say this?
Well, you can just name it on Rita Nakashimi Brock. That's the term that she uses for it.
If that God is that way, that's an abuser. And my sense is like, I want nothing to do with an abuser.
But again, my argument is it's not even consistent with the biblical narrative that's showing us, hey, we can do sacrifices, but we're going to do it this way. Right. And then slowly I'm going to get you to the point where I'm going to remind you that those sacrifices were never for me. I didn't need them. I wasn't stopped from forgiving.
Like God has more secure attachment.
Exactly. Right?
Yeah.
So then we go through this period of the prophets where God is like tearing down all these rituals, all this stuff. It's still happening, but God's saying like that alone is never going to get you there. Right. So it shows that ritual and sacrifice was always part of an equation in terms of our at-one-ment with God, but it wasn't the part that was coming from God's side. It was the part that was coming from our side, right? It was the thing that we needed to go through the motions and show the thing. What God wanted, in terms of forgiveness was a change in us, a changed heart. Then we get to Jesus, and I mean, there's a lot of, heavy stuff going on, but ultimately I think what we see in Jesus is God saying, okay, all of this violence is being carried out, and some of it is being pointed in healthier ways like sacrifice, and some of it's being pointed in unhealthy ways in terms of ostracizing the outsider and the foreigner. But now comes the time where I can show you what forgiveness actually looks like. So not a ritual that helps you feel forgiven, not the things that you need to do and change inside you to be forgiven. Now I'll show you what it looks like. So Jesus comes, allows us to treat Jesus as our scapegoat, right? Because that term comes from Leviticus. That's what they usually did. They put their sins on a goat and they chased it out of town. So we scapegoat Jesus, we put all our violence on him. And then God says, okay, here's what it looks like. In the midst of this moment, as I'm dying, as I'm taking your violence, I forgive you. You don't know what you're doing. You don't fully comprehend how evil this is. Therefore, I refuse to pay it back to you over and over again. Like violence, all of human history, violence is being transferred one to another, back and forth, and it cycles around until finally God steps into the story and says, okay, here's what forgiveness looks like. You absorb the violence, you sit with it, you feel it, you endure that pain, and then you say it stops here. Like I'm not paying it forward, I'm not doing this. So we get this model of sacrifice, which is if you need to know you're forgiven, you go through these steps and you can feel good about yourself and you can move forward. Do we get to the prophets? Forgiveness is actually about changing you and becoming a new person, living in a right way within a new kingdom in the world. Right. or Commonwealth. And then we get to Jesus, which is like, okay, now I'm going to give you the ultimate expression of what forgiveness looks like. And that's where our eyes are finally opened to all of our violence, to all of our sin, and we're freed from it. Because before that, we're trapped. Without Jesus, there's no way for us to really be aware of all of our sin, to really be aware of all of our violence. So it's only in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the human being who owes no debt to violence, who has no sin, who bears all of our sin. We put it all on Jesus, all of our violence on him. He becomes sin for us. Literally, all of our sacrifice, the way that we scapegoat things, he becomes that for us. Like that's the epitome of our sin, is when we scapegoat someone else. And Jesus says, I will become that. And in that climactic moment, when you are doing that to me, I will still tell you you're forgiven. That to me is a really beautiful way of thinking about it.
I love it. One of the things I want to walk out a little bit is, so we use the language of abuse.
Yeah.
So, I'm not interested in a God that is an abuser. How do we make sure that we're not sort of seeing this as like, it's okay that I absorb abuse?
Yeah, I think,
Do you know what I'm saying? Like when I'm mapping what you're saying out in our relationships, particularly when I think about domestic violence, that this idea that like I would just take it in and it would like I could somehow transform this sort of how do we be careful with our language when
I think we do have to be careful, but I do think this is the real crux of the gospel, that violence does not have to be paid forward. That terrible things can happen to you, and you don't to heal from that, you don't have to do it to someone else.
Right.
You don't have to pay it forward. Now,
but
does that mean...
I also want to make sure it means I'm not just like, again, just mapping it out in relationships, absorbing this horrible treatment. Like if I'm not striking back, then I'm not violent, but it becomes a violence in my
and I think this is the real challenge of it is, what does that mean and how do we live that out? How do you live with nonviolent direct action in terms of creating change, in terms of protecting yourself in the world, all these types of things, but understanding that anytime we take the violence that has been done to us and we put that onto someone else, we have now participated in that cycle over and over again. Now, I totally get what you're saying. And I think, we've talked about this in a couple series when we did Ashes. We talked about forgiveness. We talked about boundaries.
We
talked about how you,
series too,
exactly. You talked about it in that one, how you can come back to this and how you can, creating boundaries is actually part of learning how to forgive and how to protect yourself and how to remove yourself from situations where you're actively being harmed. All of that is good. And I think we would be doing a disservice not to name that part of the story as well. But as soon as it becomes, this bad thing has happened to me, therefore I need to do something bad to someone else to heal, to let this out, to find catharsis, then I think we have become part of that cycle. And that is the same thing that we're talking about when we talk about cycles of violence in terms of domestic violence in homes. When kids grow up watching that, and they watch, a mother who's abused, who then abuses children, and then children who do the same to kids on the playground. I mean, this is sort of our human story over and over again. And part of the way that I think you get out of that cycle is you learn to understand that you are loved and you are valued and you do not deserve this. Therefore, it's okay to remove yourself from this situation.
I guess I'm still trying to lean into like, how is this empowering? If I just, again, kind of walk it out, because I do love this way of speaking about atonement. I really do love this idea that like all the worst that we would throw at this moment of the cross is transformed into, that death is transformed into life, that your worst nightmare can become like this incredible way of life, way towards life. So I'm just trying to like walk that out. Like, if I'm stopping, if something violent has happened to me and instead of keeping it, what is that place of transformation? Is it like, oh, I need help, I'm going to get some help for this and begin to like you do, I think, when you're facing some of the trauma in your life, have to go in with it to move on from it. So it's something about transformation that's quite incredible. I'm just looking for like the empowered way.
I don't think having a conversation about this without naming what you're saying would be complete. You know, and I think it's wrestling with that tension all the time. I mean, the pieces that come to mind to me would be Jesus saying things like, you know, if somebody strikes you on the left, you know, or turn the other cheek, you know, that whole idea, which is about, you know, without going into it too much, you know, he's talking about a backhanded slap versus an open-handed slap, you know, which again, as strange as it sounds in our culture, is, you know, a slap being dismissive in terms of a servant or a slave or someone, and in terms of disciplining a child and this kind of thing. And Jesus saying, listen, if somebody's going to dismiss you, then you confront them and you say, if you're going to treat me that way, you're going to at least treat me as a human being. You know, if somebody demands that you walk a mile with them, which is essentially the rule in terms of Roman occupation, that a centurion could ask any occupied person who is a non-citizen to carry their stuff for a mile. You know, Jesus says, you refuse to allow them to decide what your value are, what your limits are, what you can do. You get to decide when you walk and when you don't. You choose that for yourself. If somebody, you know, sues you for your cloak, you know, you strip down, you take everything off and you hand it to them and you say, listen, if you're going to take my clothes away, I'm going to stand here naked and I'm going to show you how your greed has become naked in you and how terrible this all is. So there's ways to do, you know, and Walter Wink calls this direct nonviolent action, that this is nothing about this is passive.
Right.
Nothing about this is
that's
about just
really
allowing things to happen.
Yeah.
You know, I think this is one of the things people misunderstand because of a trick in our language when we talk about pacifism. Yeah. Which sounds like passive, but they're not the same word.
Right.
Pacifism comes from the word pacific, which means tending toward peace. Passive means like non-active, allowing things to happen.
Yeah, and that just, I'm always like, oh, no.
And I think pacifistic is about non-violent direct action to create change, to push back against things. That's great. But, you know, I mean, it does get really complicated in terms of how are you going to play that out in any given moment.
Totally.
You know, because I think there are all kinds of ways that we can justify violence. It's a violence world. Yeah. And I don't just mean physical violence, all kinds of violence.
Yes. Yeah.
And so we justify our response in all kinds of different ways. Yeah. But then what Jesus is telling us is then the world continues as it is. Right. Forgiveness is about, you know, making a break away from what the story of the world is. And that's hard and it's difficult and it's painful in some ways. You know? Yeah. But if you say that without this conversation and without naming those things, then I think it becomes ripe for all kinds of abuse.
Yeah, that's it.
You know? So it's about those tensions.
Yeah. Those are the words I think that I'm relationally mapping onto these atonement theories, is like something that's abusive and then something that's like submissive. Yeah. And where those things can be really toxic in our human relationships.
Yeah, and I mean we've seen this unfortunately, I mean there's been a number of stories in the last year out of different traditions, the Southern Baptist Convention, of, you know, pastors telling women in abusive relationships like that divorce is worse than abuse and you can't leave. Right? I mean that is that's not a way of redeeming violence with nonviolence. Exactly. That's a way of perpetuating existing violence. Yeah. You know, like that's that kind of advice. I mean, it is violence in itself because you're creating more harm to somebody. Saying to that woman in an abusive relationship, you need to leave, you need to get support, you need to be away. And here's the hard side of Christianity. You need to work towards a point somewhere where you can forgive that person.
Right. So you can.
Is it right now? Right. Exactly. Is it right now? Right. Is it this moment? No. In fact, that I think can be incredibly abusive when we tell people you have to forgive right now. But to a woman who's been abused, I want to say someday my prayer for you is that you will be able to let this go, so that you'll be whole again.
Yeah.
But you'll never be in that situation. You'll learn from this. You'll carry it with you. You'll never forget it.
Yeah.
So that you'll always be able to protect yourself. You'll never be put back in that situation.
To sort of relearn love and to know that love is for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is really important when we have these conversations.
Yeah. So we talked about penal substitution.
Yeah.
What is the name for the atonement theory that you mapped out for us?
Yeah. So there's a couple of different ways. We call it scapegoat theory. That's the main way we talk about it. Sometimes it's called substitutionary atonement. And this is one of the tricky things.
I really find this language frustrating.
Yeah.
So this part of theology.
Penal substitution, I think, is unhelpful.
Yeah.
What it's saying is we need a substitute to take the punishment from God.
Right.
Right. And so Jesus takes that penal punishment.
Yeah.
Then God is satisfied.
Right.
The term is propitiated.
Yeah.
God is propitiated, which means God is satisfied. God has no more wrath to give out. So now God can be loving. God can forgive. That's penal substitution. I don't think that's helpful. Substitutionary atonement is really important.
I just wish a woman would have written this book. Honestly,
yeah, maybe we would have.
Honestly, I'm endlessly frustrated with this language.
But I think substitution actually is really important because what it's saying is Jesus takes our place.
Right.
Right. So, and then that is really beautiful and really meaningful for me.
Okay.
Right. That Jesus takes my place. Like I see the ways that I've been mistreated. I see that in Jesus. I see that Jesus, taking that role and being that person and responding with grace. I see Jesus teaching. I see myself there. I see my sin, put on Jesus, all of those things.
Do you think we run the risk of something, again, kind of passive in that way?
Well, I mean,
does it kind of let you off the hook from the work of
isn't some of that the point of the gospel?
Is it?
Right? I think the gospel is not that, we do our work and we come out better people. Mm-hmm. I think that comes after the gospel. I think the good news, as a starting point.
The work is done.
Yeah, the work is done.
Okay.
You're forgiven. God loves you. Now there's a lifetime of work ahead of you.
Yeah.
So I'm not pushing back from that piece.
Yeah. I'm curious about it because I feel like that is a pastoral issue that I've met years and years is sort of that I keep praying this thing. Why doesn't God answer this prayer? And I'm leaning more towards something much more participatory and
sure. I'm with you 100% when it comes to that type of a thing.
But again, sort of tracing it back to where do we get this idea that we should sort of be so passive, that our prayer is so passive? Can we trace some of it back to some of this language of atonement?
It's interesting. I think in terms of gospel, it comes back to, now we can get really nerdy into...
It's after 9, dude.
Yeah, okay, let's wrap this up here quickly. But we can get really nerdy into stuff like this is what we're talking about is Pelagianism here, right? Is can you do anything in yourself to will yourself toward salvation? And sort of the Pelagian idea is yes. The semi-Pelagian is, no, but you can start that process and then God meets you in it. Traditional Christianity, orthodoxy has said, no, Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism are out of bounds. It's God that comes to us. It's blessed are the poor in spirit. It's before we did anything, before we knew anything, before we could even begin to move in the right direction, God came us and found us. Now, what you're talking about is probably in terms of ecclesiology, is how does that get played out in churches? Well, that turns into passivity, but I don't actually see Jesus teaching that.
Right.
I see Jesus saying, blessed are the poor in spirit. I have come to find you. Here I am. Let's begin this journey together. Now, take up your cross, come and follow me.
Right.
Here's my hard teachings. Leave your family if you need to. Right. Care for your neighbor.
Sell everything you have.
Exactly. There's nothing that's sort of passive in Jesus, but the initiative always starts there with Jesus in terms of how we begin to understand the good road. Yeah. And I think that is where like I am very much sort of like an Orthodox, classical, non-Pelagian Christian, that I believe that it's only in the Christ, it's only in the cross that my eyes are even opened to this possibility of not moving violence around in a circular pattern. But as soon as my eyes are open to that, well, now, if I'm taking it seriously, and now if I have a community around me that's challenging me and pushing me, well, now I have a whole lifetime of figuring out, okay, now how do I help someone who's in an abusive situation, an oppressive situation? How do I change myself so that I become the kind of person the prophets were talking about? I've had Christ meet me, but now I'm still on this journey, right? So I'm saved, but I'm being saved every day, you know, as Christ is shaping me and changing me. So
I'm just making, I just want to make sure that things are working. I lost chat function. I don't know if we're still on.
It's very possible. I mean, everything says that we're okay this time, but we've had enough problems, so you never know.
I know. I got a little distracted.
We've been talking for, it's after 9 years. What do you want to end with here?
Also, defund sacrifices was a point.
Oh, I love that. That's great. It's exactly what Jesus is saying there.
Well, we always end with gratitude, so I think we should end with gratitude. Yeah. What do you got? Ending with gratitude.
Yeah. So we were going to talk about this. We've made some changes in our plans for reopening. So we're going to go to one service for a number of reasons, but we're going to go to just a 10:30 a.m. service. So if you're interested, go to commons.church/reopen. You can reserve tickets there for that first week. But what I'm thankful for in that is an incredibly agile team at Commons, both our staff team and our board. We have some board meetings on the weekend, which you are part of, and then our meeting with the team today. And just seeing a community and a leadership that is willing to respond to change and doesn't get caught up on things and wants to be thoughtful. But at the same time, it's like, we'll adapt, we'll be agile, we'll shift, we'll change. I mean,
this is the season for agility.
So that's
is.
Honestly, I mean, I know this sounds strange, but that's what I'm really grateful for this week is just such a team that's so open to trying to figure out ways to move forward in a crazy time like this. So
that's nice. I'm really grateful for, I spent a little bit of time this afternoon listening to my sister-in-law in conversation with like a high school friend of hers. So we grew up in Esterhazy, Saskatchewan, and her family had immigrated from India, and she was born in Saskatchewan, raised in our small town community, and was one of like very few visible minorities. And I loved hearing her story from this other perspective of someone asking her the questions. I just wish I would have asked her some of these questions, like, you know, what it was really like for her in this small town to grow up, as a brown kid. And so I was so grateful that somebody took the time to engage her and that they shared it. And I put it on my Facebook page.
I haven't watched it yet, but I saw the link on there. I was reading through your description and stuff.
It's really, really neat. So I took some time. So I was just really grateful that she's my sister-in-law and we have her in our family. So I feel grateful for Helen.
Okay.
Yeah.
So apologies for getting on air like 20 minutes late today. But we figured it out.
Yeah.
We were like, should we call it? Let's just, we'll do it next week. And then I was like, but I want to figure out what was happening. So we did it.
Yeah.
And I'm proud of us for that, Bobby.
Yeah. Good job, Jared.
Yeah, we did good. All right.
Agile.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Yeah.